The town prided itself on order. From the neatly trimmed hedges lining courthouse steps to the spotless flags fluttering above government buildings, everything seemed designed to assure outsiders that justice lived here. But the paint on the walls was only surface. Beneath it, cracks ran deep, carved by decades of silence, by the unspoken rules that determined whose voice mattered and whose didn't. The courthouse itself was a monument to this illusion. High ceilings, polished marble floors, and portraits of pale faces staring down from gilded frames. Generations of judges who carried the same last names, passed down like heirlooms, each one a reminder of the power that never changed hands. The halls whispered of fairness, but the echo was hollow. For those on the margins, the courthouse was not a place of safety but of suffocation. It was the place where stories were rewritten by men in robes, where lives were reduced to accusations, where truth bent under the weight of prejudice dressed as law. The gavel, they knew, didn't fall to deliver justice, it fell to silence. In this town, silence was everywhere. It hung in the air like dust. Neighbors turned their eyes when injustice marched down the street. Employers smiled politely while paying less. Police cruisers rolled slowly through neighborhoods, their presence heavy, their radios buzzing like wasps, reminding everyone who really controlled the night. And in homes pressed against the edge of townhomes with peeling paint and cracked windows, silence was survival. Mothers learned to speak softly, to move carefully, to endure. Children learned early that questions were dangerous. They were told not to look too long, not to linger too close, not to hope too loudly. The system here was not a single man or a single law. It was a web, invisible threads tied to schools that failed certain students faster, to landlords who tightened leases around poor families like nooses, to courts that punished poverty harder than crime. The web caught some people gently, cradling them with protection and privilege. Others, it strangled. At night, the city slept easily. Those who benefited from the system never heard the restless turning of those who didn't. They never heard the whispered prayers of mothers begging for strength, or the muffled sobs of children asking why their lives always cost more. They never felt the gnawing hunger of injustice, the kind that doesn't fill with food but with fairness denied. And yet, beneath all this quiet cruelty, there was endurance, a stubborn defiance that refused to die, even when beaten, even when abandoned. It showed up in the way a mother's back stayed straight even when the world bent her low. It lived in the way children grew resilient in the cracks of neglect, sprouting like weeds through concrete. It lived in the silence, too, not as surrender, but as a waiting storm. The courthouse would become the stage for that storm. For years, it had swallowed lives whole without consequence. Judges in pressed robes signed away futures like signatures cost nothing, but the past was not gone. It lingered in faces, in bloodlines, in betrayals, buried but not erased. There was a story waiting to be told, here not written in the official records or stamped in legal ink, but carved into the hidden spaces of human lives. It was a story about power pretending to be justice, about fathers pretending not to be fathers, about how silence eventually breaks, no matter how tightly it's held. And soon, in this very courthouse, that silence would break. The walls would not be able to contain it. The portraits would not be able to watch it without shame. The gavel would strike, but instead of silencing, it would awaken. For in the heart of this polished temple of justice, truth itself was coming to trial. Morning in their neighborhood always began the same way, sirens fading into the distance, dogs barking behind rusted fences, the air thick with the smell of asphalt and smoke from someone burning last night's trash. It wasn't a place that made the news unless someone bled, but it was the place they called home. Their mother moved like a soldier through the mornings, her hands never still. She ironed clothes until the fabric thinned, scrubbed dishes until her knuckles cracked, braided hair with fingers trembling from exhaustion. Every action was love, though it rarely looked soft. Love in this house was survival, keeping food on the table, holding bills at bay, teaching her children how to walk through a world that wanted them invisible. The triplets watched her closely, each one carrying her lessons differently. The eldest wore his anger like armor. He had inherited her fire, but without her restraint. He clenched his fists at unfair grades, at suspicious stares in corner stores, at every subtle reminder that he was expected to fail. The second carried silence, absorbing pain the way walls absorb echoes. She took every insult inward, never confronting, never exploding, just folding into herself. And the youngest carried faith. She prayed the way their mother did, believing in some higher balance, even when life seemed proof against it. Together, they were fragments of their mother's strength, each shaped by her but broken in their own way. At school, they learned quickly what the world thought of them. Teachers marked their lateness harsher than others, ignoring the mornings when buses never came. Their essays earned suspicion. Did you really write this? Their presence in honors classes drew whispers that they didn't belong. Sometimes it was laughter behind them, sometimes it was the casual sting of lowered expectations. None of it made headlines. None of it was loud. But it built up, day by day, like dust in their lungs. After school, the streets became their classroom. They learned how to avoid the corner where police cruisers lingered. They learned which stores followed them through aisles. They learned that walking home in groups made them targets, but walking alone made them vulnerable. Survival was a curriculum they never asked for, but could never escape. At home, their mother worked jobs that never paid enough, cleaning houses, stocking shelves, late-night shifts that left her body aching. Yet she came home and made space for her children to dream. She told them they were worth more than this town believed, even as her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. But even inside their small apartment, shadows lingered. There were no pictures of their father, no stories, number, name, just a silence that grew heavier as they grew older. Sometimes the eldest tried to press her, to demand an answer. She only looked away. The silence was her shield, and in it lay a truth she believed would protect them. The triplets didn't know that truth was sitting in a courthouse miles away, wearing robes, delivering judgments, pretending his past didn't exist. Still, in their own ways, they dreamed. The eldest dreamed of leaving, of proving the world wrong, of building a life where anger could turn into power. The second dreamed of writing, of capturing everything no one seemed willing to hear. The youngest dreamed of healing, of being the kind of person who could undo damage instead of carrying it. But dreams in this town were fragile. They broke easily under the weight of reality. The breaking came slowly. At first, a bill overdue, a landlord's threat, an employer's warning that hours would be cut. Then it came louder, the accusation that their mother had committed a crime she hadn't, a false claim from a neighbor who wanted her gone. Injustice didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered until it grew too heavy to ignore. The triplets felt it before they understood it. The way their mother's hands shook when opening letters, the way she stared at the floor when police came knocking, the way her voice cracked when she told them everything would be fine. Everything wasn't fine. The system had chosen its target, and once chosen, it rarely let go. In their hearts, each of them carried a different fear. The eldest feared failing her, feared becoming powerless when she needed him most. The second feared being unseen, that her quietness would mean she couldn't help at all. The youngest feared that her faith was misplaced, that the prayers whispered each night were wasted words. Yet, when the summons came, when the date was set, they knew one thing with certainty. They would not let her stand alone. They dressed in their best clothes, though their shoes still bore the dust of the streets. They walked beside her, a small army bound by blood and survival. They stepped into the courthouse that had taken so many lives before them, their eyes wide but unflinching. The portraits stared down at them. The marble floors echoed under their weight, and the silence pressed heavier than ever. This was not just their mother's trial. It was their trial, to Dot, and as they entered that room, none of them could have known the man who held the gavel, the man who could decide her fate, was the same man who had abandoned them to face the world without him. The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, of years of decisions soaked into the wood. To the triplets, it was another world gleaming marble, chandeliers hanging above like watchful eyes, security guards scanning bodies, as if every one of them carried guilt. Their mother's hands trembled as she emptied her pockets, as though even her coins might be used against her. They walked in silence, the three children flanking her like sentinels. Each step echoed too loudly, making them feel exposed. They passed men in suits, women with briefcases, voices speaking in legal shorthand. None of it belonged to them. The courtroom itself was colder than expected. The air conditioning hummed against the silence. The benches creaked under the weight of strangers, and all eyes turned when the family entered. Not because they were important, but because they were different. Three children, from the wrong side of town, their mother accused of theft she hadn't committed already, marked by suspicion before a word was spoken. But at the front of the room sat the man who would decide everything, the judge. His robes were heavy, his expression unreadable. He tapped his gavel once, the sound splitting the silence like a warning. For the triplets, the sound carried more than authority, it carried finality, as if he had already decided. The eldest clenched his fists, his pulse pounding in his ears. The second kept her eyes low, memorizing every detail as though she might write it later, each injustice captured in her silent record. The youngest folded her hands, lips moving in prayer only she could hear. The prosecutor spoke first, his words, sharp and confident. He painted their mother as careless, dishonest, opportunistic, a woman who had taken what was not hers. He did not mention the unpaid overtime, the wages withheld, the exhaustion that bent her spine. He did not mention her sacrifices. He spoke only of numbers on a page, security footage grainy and unclear, witnesses whose memories shifted like sand. Their mother sat small at the defense table, a single figure dwarfed by the system surrounding her. Her appointed attorney shuffled papers nervously, his tie crooked, his arguments weak. He spoke as though apologizing for her existence, his words carrying no conviction. Each piece of evidence presented was a stone added to the pile pressing against her, a missing receipt, a coworker's suspicion, a store clerk's vague description that could fit anyone. The triplets shifted in their seats, each stone landing on their own chests, crushing their breath. The eldest wanted to stand, to shout that this wasn't justice, that this was theater performed at their expense. The second wanted to vanish, to avoid the eyes that seemed to brand them guilty by association. The youngest wanted to believe that truth mattered, that faith could tip the scales. But as the hours dragged on, truth seemed irrelevant. The judge rarely looked at their mother, his gaze often drifting to the prosecutor, nodding subtly, as if in agreement. When the defense tried to speak, he cut them short, his tone sharp, dismissive. Objections from the prosecution were sustained without pause, while those from the defense were overruled. The imbalance was clear to anyone willing to see, and yet, in that room, few were willing. A woman in the gallery whispered, shaking her head as though she already knew the outcome. A man in uniform smirked when the defense stumbled. The jury sat stiff, their eyes avoiding the families, their expressions betraying the discomfort of people who wanted the trial over so they could return to their own lives. The triplets felt it, the inevitability of injustice. The walls were closing in, the floor tilting beneath them. Still, they watched their mother sit tall, her back straight despite the weight pressing down. Her silence was not surrender, it was survival. She knew the cost of raising her voice in spaces like this. She had learned long ago that even truth could be punished, but the children could not escape. The feeling that something deeper pulsed beneath the surface. The way the judge's eyes lingered too long. The way he shifted when their mother's name was spoken, his jaw tightening. The way his gavel strikes seemed harsher whenever she dared to look up. The eldest noticed it first, a flicker of recognition, hidden but not gone. It unsettled him, though he couldn't place why. The second caught it too, though she buried the thought, afraid of where it might lead. The youngest, whispering her prayers, felt a chill when his gaze met hers, a look not of indifference, but of something unspoken. The trial stretched across days, each one carving at their hope. Reporters never came. No one outside seemed to care. For the family, time slowed into a cruel rhythm. Accusations, dismissals, dismissive gavel strikes, the heavy shuffle of leaving the room with nothing resolved. By the third day, the children began to realize they weren't just fighting for their mother, they were fighting against a machine built to strip people like them of dignity. Every dismissal, every bias, every cold glance was proof. On the fourth day, the prosecutor delivered his closing arguments. He spoke with certainty, as though guilt was already carved into stone. His words echoed off marble, sinking into the jury like nails driven deep. The defense stammered, offering weak rebuttals, his papers slipping from his hands. The judge sighed audibly, as though patience itself was an indulgence. The children's hearts raced. They clung to each other on the bench, waiting, fearing, praying. Then came the pause, the silence before the judge spoke. The air thickened, the room leaning toward his words, and though no verdict had yet been read, the children knew they were standing on the edge of something larger than this trial, something buried, something dangerous, something that would change everything they thought they knew. The judge's gavel struck once more. The sound vibrated through their bones. The eldest felt fury, the second felt dread. The youngest felt a tremor of revelation, though she didn't yet understand it. The rising storm had only begun. The fifth day of trial dawned gray, as if the sky itself carried the weight of what was about to unfold. Rain clung to the courthouse windows, streaking the glass like tears no one was brave enough to shed. Inside, the family sat in silence. Children had stopped whispering among themselves, their nerves too frayed. Their mothers smoothed her skirt again and again, each motion precise, controlled, the only thing she could command in a room determined to strip her of dignity. The judge entered late that morning. When he took his seat, the room seemed too still in deference, not to him, but to the gravity of his presence. His robes swished as he adjusted himself, his eyes sweeping the courtroom. For a flicker of a second, they lingered on the triplets, then darted away. The eldest felt it like a blow. The second's stomach twisted. The youngest dropped her gaze, her prayer faltering. The trial resumed with its usual rhythm of objections, dismissals, the prosecutor's confidence swelling as if he were certain of victory. The defense, limp as ever, tried to thread arguments that unraveled before they were even heard, but beneath the motions, something shifted. The judge was restless. His questions grew sharper, his interruptions more forceful. He leaned forward often, his voice weighted with impatience. When the prosecutor finished, the judge didn't simply nod. He almost smiled. The children noticed. Their mother noticed. Everyone noticed. And then it happened. The defense attorney, desperate, attempted to humanize her. She is not the woman they paint her to be. She has sacrificed her life for her children. The judge cut him off. Stick to the facts, counselor. But the lawyer pressed, stumbling. She works 2 jobs. She raised them alone since their father abandoned them. The words hung in the air like a dropped glass, shattering the room's brittle silence. The judge froze. The triplets froze. Even the prosecutor, so smug moments before, faltered. Their mother's breath caught. Her hands trembled as though struck by lightning. The judge's face hardened, but too late. The flicker of recognition, of something raw and exposed, was already visible. The eldest saw it first, the way his jaw tightened. Not in impartiality, but in personal wound. He leaned forward on the bench, his chest burning. The second felt her pulse in her ears. Her pen scratched furiously against paper, though her hand shook, desperate to capture this moment, to give words to what no one dared say aloud. The youngest whispered a single word, one no one else heard. No. The judge cleared his throat, his voice colder than ice. This line of argument is irrelevant. Strike it from the record. But the words couldn't be struck from the children's minds. Abandoned. Father. The courtroom seemed to tilt, the marble pillars bending, the floor threatening to give way. The defense attorney stammered, tried to retreat, but the damage was done. The silence that followed was louder than any gavel strike. Their mother kept her eyes low, her body rigid, as if bracing for a storm. But the children saw the truth etched across her face, fear, shame, rage, all braided together. The judge leaned back, masking himself in composure, but the mask was cracked. His gaze flicked again too fast. Telling toward the children. The eldest rose before he realized it, his voice breaking the silence. What did he mean? Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff barked, "Sit down." But the boy didn't move. The judge's gavel slammed. Order in the court. But the boy's voice rose above it, trembling with fury. What did he mean? Abandoned. Who are you? The youngest began to sob, clutching her mother's arm, her prayers lost in the chaos. The second scribbled wildly, her tears smearing ink, as she forced the moment into permanence, refusing to let it vanish. The mother's silence was deafening. She stared straight ahead, her lips pressed shut, refusing to confirm what the children already knew in their bones. The judge's gavel struck again and again, the sound frantic now, desperate. Order. But order was gone. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, sensing the trial slipping from his grip. Jurors exchanged glances, their unease growing. The gallery buzzed with whispers, the rumor igniting before the truth was spoken. Finally, the eldest shouted, his voice breaking, "You're him, aren't you? You're our father." The words split the courtroom open. The judge's hand froze mid, his face drained of color, then flushed dark. His eyes locked on the children, not with indifference, but with a fury edged in guilt. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. The man beneath the robe struggling against the authority of the bench. "I am not here to answer personal accusations," he said. but his voice shook. The eldest stepped forward, the bailiff moving to block him, but rage gave him strength. You left us, you left her, and now you sit there pretending to judge her. The second whispered, broken. All this time, the youngest wailed, her small body rocking, unable to bear the weight of the truth. Their mother finally spoke, her voice cracking. Enough. The single word silenced them all. She rose slowly, dignity clinging to her, even as the world threatened to strip her bare. She turned to her children, tears shining but unshed. Yes, she whispered, he is your father. The room gasped again. The jurors leaned forward. The gallery erupted. The judge slammed his gavel until his hand trembled. This is irrelevant. This is inadmissible. But the truth, once spoken, could not be dismissed. The children's world collapsed and sharpened all at once. Every look, every gesture, every bias across the trial crystallized. He had known, and still sat above them, passing judgment as if untethered from the wreckage he had created. The eldest felt his fists bleed where his nails dug deep. The second's notebook tore beneath her pen. The youngest clung to her mother, her prayers shifting from hope to despair. The mother closed her eyes. She had carried the secret to protect them, to keep them from the cruelty of knowing, but cruelty had found them anyway. The judge straightened, the mask returning though the cracks remained. His voice cut like a blade. This trial will proceed. The jury will disregard irrelevant personal matters. But no one could disregard it. Not the children, not the mother, not even the jurors whose shifting eyes betrayed the poison now seeping into their trust. The gavel fell once more, but its authority was hollow, for in that moment the courtroom ceased to be a place of law. It became a battlefield of blood and betrayal. Justice twisted into something unrecognizable, and the children knew, whatever the verdict, their lives had already changed forever. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was a storm contained within 4 stone walls, lightning flashing in every gaze, thunder rumbling in every whisper. The revelation hung heavy in the air, refusing to disperse. The jurors exchanged glances, their pens stilled, their eyes flickering between the defendant and the judge. They were no longer impartial arbiters. They were witnesses to a wound gaping open before them. The gallery buzzed with feverish murmurs until the bailiff barked for silence. Even then, the whispers lingered like the hiss of burning coals. The judge adjusted himself on the bench, trying to reclaim authority. His voice rang out, stern but frayed at the edges. This court will not entertain irrelevant personal matters. We are here to try a case, not to unravel domestic history. But his words fell flat. The eldest of the triplets sat rigid, his fists clenched, jaw tight. His world had shifted, the foundation cracked. He could not unsee the truth that this man who had abandoned them, now cloaked in power, daring to decide their mother's fate. The second stared at her notebook. The pages blurred beneath her tears, but her pen scratched anyway, each word carved with desperation. If she stopped writing, she feared the truth might vanish, might be rewritten by the very man who had already rewritten their lives with his absence. The youngest pressed into her mother's side. Trembling, her prayers faltered into fragments. Please, not him, not him, not him. Their mother sat upright, still as stone. Her silence spoke louder than any protest. She had endured years alone, carried the burden of abandonment, and now the secret was ripped from her hands and flung into the public eye. The prosecutor rose, trying to seize control. Your Honor, I move to strike this line entirely from the record. The defense is attempting to manipulate the jury through irrelevant, inflammatory claims. The defense attorney, pale and sweating, stammered. I did not intend. The judge cut him off with a sharp gavel strike. Enough. The jury will disregard the last statement. Counsel, if you cannot keep your arguments tethered to fact, this court will have no choice but to consider sanctions. But the words were empty. Everyone knew it. The eldest leaned forward, whispering through clenched teeth. He can't do this. He can't judge her. He has no right. The second's pen scratched. The judge is compromised. The trial is poisoned. We are not safe. The youngest buried her face into her mother's arm, whispering broken prayers into fabric damp with tears. The trial lurched forward, but every exchange felt poisoned. Every ruling waited. Objections from the defense were met with swift, cutting denials. The prosecutor's missteps were smoothed over with indulgence. The imbalance, once subtle, now burned with naked clarity. Each strike of the gavel rang like mockery. The defense attorney's voice cracked as he tried to summon courage. Your Honor, with all due respect, I must request a recusal. It is apparent the judge's gavel slammed down. Denied. But, Your Honor, denied. The word thundered, silencing the courtroom. His eyes, dark and furious, dared anyone to challenge him. The eldest shot to his feet. You can't deny it. You're our father. You left us, and now you want to destroy her too. The bailiff moved fast, gripping the boy's shoulder, forcing him back into his seat. His mother's hand reached out, trembling, pulling him down, before harm could reach him. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Please, don't. The boy sat, shaking, rage burning through his veins. The judge adjusted his robe, his composure cracking further, his face flushed, and for a heartbeat, his eyes betrayed something rash, fear, perhaps, recognition. Then the masks slammed back into place. This court will proceed without further interruption. Any additional outbursts will result in contempt charges. But the children were beyond threats. Their very existence was contempt in his eyes, and they knew it. The prosecutor resumed, though his confidence faltered under the weight of chaos. His voice wavered as he pressed witnesses, as though afraid the truth might leak again, staining his carefully constructed case. Witnesses shifted uncomfortably under questioning. Some faltered, their words softer, less certain, as though they too now doubted the ground beneath their feet. The second scribbled furiously. Even lies tremble in the face of truth. The mother remained silent, refusing to speak when prompted. Her stillness was an act of defiance. The prosecutor tried to paint it as guilt. The defense tried to frame it as dignity. But in truth, it was something else entirely. Survival. Every moment dragged, each tick of the clock louder, heavier. The children felt trapped in a cage of marble and oak, forced to watch their mother's soul be dissected under the gaze of the man who had abandoned her. The eldest whispered to his sisters, his voice low and venomous. We're not leaving here without fighting him. One way or another, he's going to answer for this. The second met his gaze, her tears burning with resolve. We'll expose him. Even if no one listens. Even if they bury it. We'll make sure it's written. It won't be erased. The youngest only shook her head, clutching tighter to their mother. I just want it to end. Please, I just want it to end. The trial pressed on, each ruling, each testimony twisting deeper into cruelty. The mother's humanity was dissected, her character gutted, the judge's bias sharpened with every exchange, his gavel a blade rather than a balanced dot at one point. The defense attorney tried again, voice trembling with desperation. Your Honor, this trial cannot proceed under these circumstances. You are. The judge's glare silenced him. One more word, counselor, and you will be held in contempt. The attorney swallowed his protest, his shoulders sagging in defeat. The children watched, helpless, fury mixing with despair. The eldest thought of standing again, of shouting until the world listened. The second thought of slipping her words into the public record, somehow smuggling the truth out of these suffocating walls. The youngest thought only of running, of escaping the shadow that loomed larger than the law itself. The day bled into evening, the rain outside deepening, drumming against the courthouse like a heartbeat. By the time the judge adjourned, the courtroom was drenched in exhaustion, but not relief. The gavel struck. This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. The words were formal, sterile, but the tone betrayed something humanitarian, strained. The bailiff called for order as people shuffled out. The jurors' faces were pale, shaken. The gallery whispered feverishly, rumors already racing faster than fact. The children clung to their mother as they were escorted out, the eldest's arm wrapped around her shoulders, his fury coiled but unspent. The second carried her notebook pressed to her chest, the ink smudged, the truth raw. The youngest leaned into her mother's side, her sobs muffled against fabric. The mother walked with head high, even as her steps faltered. Each stride was a refusal to break before the man who had already broken her once. Behind them, the judge lingered alone in his chambers, his gavel abandoned on the bench. His hands trembled as he poured whiskey into a glass, his reflection in the dark liquor more familiar than the children's eyes had been. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to whisper their names. But whispers could not undo what had been spoken aloud. The trial would continue, and with it, so would the storm. The rain had not stopped by morning. It fell in relentless sheets, pounding the courthouse windows, drowning the city in gray. To the children, It felt less like weather and more like the world itself grieving, weeping, ahead of what was to come. Entered the building as though walking into an execution chamber. The air was heavy, the marble cold beneath their feet. Every footstep echoed like a countdown. Their mother walked between them, shoulders squared, her silence a fragile shield. She wore the same dress as yesterday, the fabric worn at the sleeves, but pressed clean. Her dignity was the only possession she still owned, and she wore it like armor. The eldest kept close to her side, his hand hovering at her back, ready to steady her if she faltered. His face was tight, lips pressed into a thin line, his fury barely contained. The second carried her notebook, its spine frayed, its pages swollen with ink and tears. She clutched it to her chest as though it were the only truth she could save. Youngest gripped her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. She whispered the same prayer over and over, lips barely moving. Please don't take her. Please don't take her. Please don't take her. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restless energy. The gallery filled early, rumor drawing curious faces. The jury filed in eyes, downcast, as though ashamed of what they already knew they must do. The judge took his seat, his robe draped heavy, his face carved from stone. No flicker of recognition crossed his features as he glanced at the children. He was a man determined to erase what had been revealed, to bury it beneath procedure and verdict. The prosecutor stood tall, voice polished, rehearsed. He painted the mother as negligent, irresponsible, a danger cloaked in pity. His words cut like glass, each one slicing at her dignity. The defense attorney stumbled through his rebuttal, his voice hoarse with defeat. He begged for mercy, for reason, for a justice that had no place in this room. His pleas fell flat, drowned by the weight of a system aligned against them. The jury left to deliberate. Though everyone knew there was nothing left to deliberate, the children sat in silence, the seconds dragging like years. Every tick of the clock drove nails deeper into their chests. The eldest leaned forward, his fists clenched, whispering through his teeth, "They're going to take her. I know it. They've already decided." The second shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "No, no, they can't. People saw. People heard. They know he's our." She stopped herself, the word caught in her throat, sour, unspoken. The youngest buried her face in her mother's lap, whispering her prayer, faster now, as though speed could change the outcome. Their mother stroked her hair gently, her hand trembling. She said nothing, because she already knew. The doors opened, the jury filed back in, faces pale, eyes fixed anywhere but the defense table. The foreman stood, holding the verdict slip in hands that shook. On the charge brought against the defendant, his voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. The jury, find the defendant guilty." The word detonated in the children's chests. The eldest shot to his feet, his chair crashing behind him. "No, no, this is wrong. You know it's wrong." The bailiff lunged, pushing him back into his seat. His mother's hand reached for him, desperate. "Please, my son, please, don't." The second's notebook slipped from her hands, pages scattering across the floor. Her words, her desperate attempt to preserve truth, fluttered like wounded birds, trampled beneath shuffling shoes. The youngest wailed, her cry piercing through the solemn air, shattering the court's pretense of dignity. She clung to her mother's dress, sobbing uncontrollably. The judge lifted his gavel. His voice was cold, steady, merciless. "Order. This court will have order." But the children could not be silenced. Their grief poured out raw, uncontainable. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, murmurs rising, a wave of unease that even the gavel could not quell. The judge's sentence followed swiftly, each word a hammer blow. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to." The words blurred for the children, drowned by the roar of blood in their ears. All they knew was that their mother would not be walking home with them. The eldest lunged forward, his voice breaking. "You're not a judge, you're a coward. You abandoned us, and now you're killing her." The bailiffs restrained him, dragging him back as he fought, teeth clenched, eyes blazing. His mother's voice cut through his rage, trembling, breaking. "Please, my son, don't let him take you to." The second scrambled to gather her pages, her hands shaking, tears smearing the ink. She clutched the ruined notebook to her chest, whispering to herself, "I'll keep it safe. I'll keep it alive. They can't erase it. They can't." The youngest clung tighter, sobbing, her small body trembling with every broken breath. "Don't go, Mama. Please, don't go." Their mother bent low, pressing her forehead to each of them in turn. Her voice was soft, steady. though her heart shattered beneath every word. My loves, listen to me. You are stronger than this room, stronger than him. Don't let this be the end of you. The bailiffs moved to take her arms. She did not resist. She rose with quiet dignity, though her body shook. The children clung to her, desperate. The eldest tried to fight them off. The second screamed. The youngest wailed until her voice broke. The judge banged his gavel again and again, each strike a desecration, drowning out their cries. Order. Remove the children if necessary. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Gallery members whispered, some with pity, others with judgment. The jury sat frozen, faces pale with the weight of what they had done. As the bailiffs pulled her away, the mother turned once more. Her eyes met, her children's, wide with grief and love. She mouthed the words they would never forget, "I'm sorry," and then she was gone. The children collapsed into each other, their cries filling the hollow space she left behind. The eldest cursed the walls, the judge, the world itself. The second held her notebook as though it were her mother's hand, promising through sobs to keep the truth alive. The youngest rocked in place, whispering prayers into the emptiness, begging a God who seemed deaf. Behind the bench, the judge sat motionless, his face carved into cold authority. But beneath the robe, his hands trembled, hidden from view. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving the children huddled together in silence. The rain outside pounded harder, as though the sky itself wept with them. By the time they were let out, the world felt different, colder, smaller, broken. The verdict was final that their mother was gone, and the system had consumed them whole. The house was no longer a home. When the children returned, escorted by a silent social worker whose pity only deepened their wounds, every room seemed hollow, stripped of warmth. The walls held her scent still, the faint trace of soap and pressed clothes, but it was fading already, as though the world itself conspired to erase her. The eldest walked through the door first, jaw tight, fists clenched. He would not cry, not here, not where the walls might mock him with silence. His chest ached, his throat burned, but he swallowed it down until it became a stone lodged in his body. The second stumbled in after him, clutching her ruined notebook. She dropped to her knees in the living room and spread the pages before her, trying desperately to piece them back together. Her tears fell onto the ink, smearing what little was left, but she could not stop. Every word she had written felt like her mother's voice, and to lose them was to lose her all over again. The youngest refused to let go of the doorway. She stood frozen, her small body trembling, eyes fixed on the chair where her mother once sat in the evenings, humming softly while mending clothes. The chair was empty now, and the silence screamed louder than any voice. The social worker spoke in hushed tones, promises of arrangements and temporary care. But the children did not hear her. They only heard absence, a void that no words could fill. When the woman finally left, the slam of the door echoed like a gunshot. The house fell still, the rain outside the only sound. The eldest paced the room, restless, consumed by rage. His voice broke through the silence, sharp and jagged. They took her. They stole her. And we just let them. The second shook her head violently, clutching her notebook tighter. No, no, no. I wrote everything down. It's here. If I keep it, if I remember, they can't win. They can't erase her. The youngest whimpered, covering her ears. Stop. Please stop. Mama will hear us. She'll come back if we're quiet. She has to. The eldest's anger cracked then, spilling into despair. He slammed his fist against the wall, leaving a shallow dent in the plaster. His voice broke into sobs he could not suppress. She's not coming back. Don't you get it? They've taken her, and she's gone. The youngest screamed at him, her voice shrill with desperation. Don't say that. Don't you ever say that. The second tried to hold them both, but her own body shook with grief. The three of them collapsed together on the floor, a tangled heap of tears, rage, and broken prayers. That night, the house did not sleep. That eldest sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, his mind a storm of rage and helplessness. Every shadow became the judge's face, every thunderclap the gavel striking again and again. He fantasized about breaking into the courthouse, tearing down the walls, making them all pay. But when he clenched his fists, he felt how small his hands were, how powerless. The second lit a candle on the kitchen table and spread her ruined pages across the wood. She tried to rewrite them from memory, her pen scratching desperately, but her hand shook too much. Words slipped away from her, like sand through her fingers. She cried quietly, whispering to herself, if I can't remember, then she dies. Twice. The youngest crawled into her mother's bed, burying her face in the pillow. It no longer smelled like her, not fully, and that absence hollowed her chest. She whispered into the dark, Mama, I'll be good, I'll be so good. Please, come back. Her voice broke, but she kept repeating it until sleep finally took her. Days blurred. The neighbors avoided them, some out of discomfort, others out of judgment. Food was left on the porch sometimes, wrapped in foil, but no one knocked. The children were pariahs. Now, shadows of a scandal everyone wanted to forget. The eldest wandered the streets at night, shoulders hunched, daring anyone to challenge him. He returned home bruised some mornings, knuckles raw, but he never explained. Violence became the only language that still made sense to him. The second filled notebook after notebook, her handwriting frantic, her words tumbling over one another. She copied down everything she remembered about her mother, her laugh, the lullabies, the way she folded towels in thirds. But with every page, fear gnawed at her that one day she would forget something important, and that forgetting would be another betrayal. The youngest grew quiet. She stopped praying aloud. She carried one of her mother's scarves everywhere, rubbing it between her fingers until the threads frayed. Sometimes she sat in the corner, rocking, eyes vacant, as though waiting for someone who would never come. Weeks passed. One evening, they gathered in the living room without speaking. The silence pressed down heavier than the rain outside. The second read aloud from her notebook, her voice trembling. She said we were stronger than this room, stronger than him. She said not to let it be the end of us. The eldest barked a bitter laugh, sharp as broken glass. Stronger. Look at us. We're nothing without her. The youngest whimpered, clutching her scarf tighter. Don't say that. Please don't say that. The second's voice rose, fierce, despite her tears. She believed in us. Even when they dragged her away, she believed. If we give up now, then they win. Don't you see? That's what they want. The eldest turned on her, eyes blazing. And what do you want me to do? Write pretty words like you. Pray like her. None of it changes anything. She's still gone. They still won. The second slammed her notebook shut, her tears spilling over. Then, what's the point of us being here at all? The words froze in the air, heavy, terrible. Even the youngest stopped rocking, staring at her sister with wide, hollow eyes. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then the eldest dropped his head into his hands, his voice breaking. I don't know. I don't know. They clung to each other then, three broken pieces of a shattered whole, trembling in the dark. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the children sat in silence, the weight of their loss pressing down until they could hardly breathe. They had reached the bottom. There was no light, no hope, no way forward, only the dark night of the soul. The silence in the house lingered like a sickness. Days bled into one another without shape, without purpose. Yet in that shapelessness, the smallest things began to stir like cracks of light through a boarded window. It began with the youngest. One morning, she awoke, clutching her mother's scarf, as usual, but instead of staying curled beneath the blanket, she rose. Her tiny feet carried her into the kitchen where the sink overflowed with unwashed dishes, the air thick with the smell of neglect. She dragged a stool to the counter, filled the basin with water, and began to scrub. Her hands were too small. The plates slipped and clattered, and soap bubbles foamed up to her elbows, but she kept going. When the eldest stormed in, bleary-eyed from another night of wandering, he stopped in the doorway, frowning. What are you doing? He asked, voice rough. She looked up at him, chin trembling but eyes steady. Mama wouldn't want it to smell bad. The words struck him deeper than he expected. For the first time in weeks, he didn't shout, didn't sneer. He just stood there, the anger drained from him. He grabbed a towel and began drying the plates beside her. The second joined them quietly. Setting aside her notebook for the first time in days, she fetched more soap, rinsed cups, stacked bowls. It wasn't much, but for that moment, they weren't drowning separately. They were surviving together. That afternoon, the second found herself sitting on the porch steps, notebook open in her lap. For once, she didn't write about grief or loss. Instead, she sketched a memory, her mother's hands braiding her hair while singing a tune under her breath. The melody was faint in her memory, but she hummed what she could, low and shaky. The youngest perked up at the sound. Sitting beside her, scarf still clutched. That's Mama's song, she whispered. The eldest leaned against the railing, arms folded. He wanted to scoff, to dismiss it as weakness. But instead, he listened. The tune, broken though it was, wrapped around him like something half forgotten, yet deeply familiar. He didn't hum along, not yet, but his jaw unclenched. Later that week, the eldest returned from one of his nighttime wanderings with something different bread. It wasn't much, half stale, pilfered from the back of a shop butt when he set it on the table. The girls stared at him as if he'd conjured gold. He sat heavily, avoiding their eyes. Don't just look at it, eat. The youngest tore off a piece eagerly. The second hesitated, watching him. You didn't steal this, did you? He glared at her, but his voice was tired rather than sharp. Does it matter? You're hungry. She'd want us fed. The second lowered her gaze. She hated the thought of him risking trouble, but he was right. Survival mattered. For the first time, she saw his recklessness, not only as anger but as love twisted into something raw and dangerous. They ate together, the simple act binding them more tightly than words. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, the youngest pulled her siblings toward the living room. She insisted they sit in their mother's old chair one after the other. She used to say this chair made her brave, she whispered. The eldest scoffed. But when he sat, something shifted. The weight of the wood beneath him, the worn fabric that still held traces of her presence, it was grounding. He didn't say so aloud, but when he rose, he lingered a moment longer than he meant to. The second sat next, clutching her notebook in her lap. She closed her eyes, imagined her mother's hand on her shoulder, and for a fleeting second, she felt it. She exhaled slowly, her grip loosening. When it was the youngest's turn, she climbed into the chair and pulled the scarf tight around her. Her voice, small but sure, filled the room. She's not here, but maybe she's still with us. Number one answered. But no one denied it either. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible. The eldest began repairing small things around the house, the broken hinge on the cupboard, the squeaky step on the stairs. He did it without words, his actions filling the silence that once suffocated them. The second started writing differently. Instead of recording only pain, she wove fragments of memory into stories, moments of laughter, warmth, the lessons their mother left behind. She read them aloud at night, her siblings listening as though the words themselves kept them tethered. The youngest, though still quiet, began to laugh again. The sound startled them all the first time, but it wasn't forced, it was soft, genuine, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Yet even with these fragile sparks, the weight remained. Some nights, the eldest still punched walls until his knuckles bled. Some mornings, the second tore pages from her notebook in frustration. Some afternoons, the youngest curled up in the empty bed, waiting for a return that would never come. But between those moments, there was something else, something new, a stubborn flicker that refused to die. One night, gathered on the floor with candlelight flickering, the second whispered what they had all been afraid to say. We can't stay like this forever. The eldest frowned. And what else are we supposed to do? Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. She told us not to let it be the end. If we just sit here, then it is. We have to do something. The youngest looked up, eyes wide. Like what? Silence stretched, heavy but not hopeless. The second stared into the flame, her jaw tightening. I don't know yet, but I'll find out. We'll find out. For the first time since the courtroom, the eldest didn't argue. He didn't believe yet, but he didn't crush the thought either. That was enough. The candle burned low. The storm outside quieted. Inside, the triplets sat close, shoulders touching. The silence no longer suffocating but tentative, waiting. The darkness was still there, vast and heavy. But in it, a thread of light had been pulled. Fragile, flickering, yet real. And real was enough. The weeks that followed did not erase the shadows, but the shadows no longer had free rein. Where once silence had been suffocating, now whispers moved through the houseplans not yet formed, questions not yet answered, but alive. It was the second who first gave the whispers form. One afternoon, she walked to the edge of town where the courthouse loomed, its stone walls gray against the sky. She stood at a distance, notebook pressed to her chest, watching as lawyers and clerks filtered in and out. Her stomach twisted. Every instinct told her to run, to hide. But instead, she wrote. She wrote down names. She overheard fragments of conversations, the way people sneered at her presence before looking away, her pen carved into the paper like claws. She didn't know what she was building yet, but she knew it mattered. When she returned home, the eldest demanded, "Why go near that place?" She looked up at him, eyes burning. Because that's where they tried to erase her. I won't let them. He didn't argue, he just turned away, jaw tight, hiding the faintest flicker of respect. The youngest, though still small and fragile, began asking questions that startled them both. Why did they hate her so much? Why didn't anyone stop them? Doesn't anyone care what happened? Each question was a knife, carving open wounds they wanted to leave closed. But the youngest's persistence forced them to answer, forced them to admit the ugliness aloud. One night, after the third such question, the eldest slammed his fist on the table. Enough. You're too young to understand. But the youngest did not flinch. She stared at him, lips trembling but voice steady. Then, make me understand. The second reached across the table, taking her hand. We'll tell you, all of it, because if you don't know, then they win. And so they began to share halting, painful, raw, the trial, the lies, the glares, the gavel that sealed their mother's fate. The youngest cried, but she did not look away. When it was done, her face was blotchy, her scarf damp with tears, but her words were clear. Then we have to make them hear the truth. The room went silent, and something shifted. The eldest resisted at first. His way of coping had always been fists, walls, reckless defiance without aim, planning, speaking, writing. Those were for others. But one night, as he returned from wandering the streets, he heard men laughing outside a tavern. Their voices carried venomous pride. Good riddance. That woman thought she could stand above her station. Now her brats will learn where they belong. Rage surged hot and blinding. His fists itched to break their teeth. But instead, he clenched them and walked away. Not because the anger wasn't there, but because for the first time, he saw that violence would only feed their story. When he reached home, he told his sisters what he'd heard. The second's face hardened. Then we give them a different story. And for the first time, the eldest nodded. The triplets began meeting at night in the living room, candlelight flickering on their faces. The notebook became their anchor, filled with overheard words, remembered details, pieces of truth their mother had been denied. The second wrote with fierce precision. The youngest offered memories of their mother, her kindness, her quiet strength, her laughter echoing in the kitchen. The eldest contributed reluctantly at first, but his raw descriptions of the trial's cruelty brought the record to life. Page by page, the silence that had once smothered them was transformed into testimony. Did not yet know who would read it, but they knew why they wrote, because their mother's story deserved to live. It was not only words that marked their resistance. Small acts of defiance began to thread through their days. The eldest, once feared for his temper, began walking the streets with his head high, not as prey, but as witness. When shopkeepers muttered under their breath, he met their eyes until they looked away. The second, with her quiet determination, began slipping scraps of her writing into places where others might find them, tucked into library books, left on benches, folded beneath stones at the market. Short fragments, never signed, each carrying a piece of truth. The youngest, though smallest, became bold in ways that startled them all. When a neighbor sneered, she answered back, not with venom, but with questions that cut sharper. Why? Are you afraid of her name? Why do you hate someone who never harmed you? Her innocence was disarming, her courage contagious. Not all responded kindly. One afternoon, the eldest returned with a split lip, muttering about men who didn't like questions. The second's scattered writings were torn down as quickly as she placed them. The youngest was shoved aside in the market, her scarf yanked and thrown in the dirt. Each attack stung, reopening wounds, but instead of retreating, they grew sharper. The eldest began training his fists not for aimless rage, but for disciplined punching the air, striking wood, controlling his breath until anger became fuel rather than fire. The second refined her words, learning to write not only with anger, but with precision, phrases that could pierce rather than merely burn. The youngest clung tighter to her scarf, wearing it proudly even when others mocked. She refused to let them strip her mother's presence away. Their pain became their weapon. One evening, rain pounded against the windows as they gathered again. The candle sputtered, shadows dancing across their faces. The second spread the notebook across the table, pages filled to the brim. We have her story now, but it can't stay here. If it does, it dies with us. The eldest leaned forward, voice low. And what do you suggest? March into that courthouse. They'll laugh in our faces or worse. Her gaze didn't waver. Then we find another way. Someone will listen. Someone has to. The youngest whispered, but what if no one does? The silence was heavy. The question lingered. At last, the eldest spoke, his voice rough but steady. Then we make them. It was the first time they spoke not only of survival, but of fighting back. Not with fists alone, not with despair, but with story, with presence, with relentless refusal to be erased. The air in the room shifted. The candle burned low, but its flame seemed brighter. For the first time since their mother's death, their grief was no longer only a weight. It was a weapon. And weapons, once forged, do not lie idle. That night, as they finally blew out the candle, the youngest whispered into the dark, she'd be proud. The second reached for her hand. The eldest lay awake, long after, staring at the ceiling, chest tight. For once, it wasn't rage that kept him awake, it was resolve. The silence of the house was no longer suffocating, it was waiting. The town had grown used to silence. For months after the trial, the courthouse had loomed like an immovable stone fortress, its verdict echoing in every hushed conversation, its weight pressing on every door. People pretended not to remember, not to see, not to care. But silence, once broken, cannot be mended. It began small. A fragment of paper slipped into a pocket, a phrase overheard in the marketplace. She told the truth, but they buried it. Her children still remembered. No one admitted to reading them, but the scraps spread. One merchant found one folded in with his stock ledger. A teacher discovered one tucked into a clerk picked up a crumpled sheet in the courthouse hallway and paled when he read the words. They were unsigned, untraceable. But everyone knew where they came from. The triplets had begun to breach the walls. The eldest noticed it first. The looks, people who once spat at them now stared longer, uncertain. The sneers had not vanished, but behind them lurked unease. He walked the streets more openly, shoulders squared, his mother's shadow in his stride. He knew the risks. He felt the stairs sharpen, felt footsteps trailing behind him. Once, a rock flew past his shoulder, striking the wall. He didn't flinch, he just turned, slow and deliberate, until the boys who had thrown it lowered their eyes and ran. The second continued writing. Her words, sharper now, no longer whispers, but knives. Truth cannot be buried forever. Justice is not blind. It looks away. She was our mother. She was more than what they called her. The youngest surprised them most. She began speaking aloud, not to strangers, not yet, but to neighbors who once turned their backs. She asked questions with that same unflinching innocence. Why do you believe them? Would you have stood with her if it was you? Do you think it will end with us? Some cursed, some walked away, but some hesitated, and hesitation was enough. The first open clash came at the market. The youngest had placed one of her sister's notes in the basket of an old woman who sold bread. A man saw her, snatched it, and held it high. Lies, he shouted, voice thick with contempt. These children are poisoning our town with their filth. A crowd gathered quickly, hungry for spectacle. The eldest stepped forward, fists tight, at his sides, his body a wall between his sisters and the mob. Give it back, he said, his voice low. The man sneered, waving the paper. You want the lies, take them. Better yet, burn them, so your mother's shame dies with her. The eldest jaw flexed, his fists twitched. But he remembered the discipline he had sworn to himself. Instead of striking, he reached out and tore the paper from the man's hand, crumpling it against his chest. The second stepped forward before the crowd. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. They called her a liar. But we were there, we saw, and we remember. You can tear every page, but you can't erase what's true. The crowd buzzed, mutters like hornets in the air. Some spat at the ground, others looked away. A few shifted uneasily, not meeting her gaze. The youngest clutched her scarf tight, her small voice ringing out. She was our mother. You cannot take her from us again. For a long moment, the mob didn't know what to do. Then the man cursed, turned on his heel, and stormed off. The tension bled, and people drifted away, leaving the three siblings standing alone but unbowed. It was their first victory. Small, fragile, dangerous, but a victory. Danger grew sharper. Days later, the eldest returned home with bruises across his ribs. He refused to say who had done it, but his silence told the truth. The whispers of resistance had reached ears that wanted them silenced. The second found some of her writings shredded and scattered across the courthouse steps. A cruel warning. Youngest awoke one night to find their windows smeared with mud. Words scrawled across the glass. Stop, or join her. Fear slithered back into their bones, but it no longer held them as it once had. Instead, it hardened into resolve. "If they're afraid enough to threaten us," the eldest said grimly, "it means they know we're getting through." It was the courthouse that called them next. Not by invitation, none would dare summon them, but by pull. Every whisper, every fragment of defiance, seemed to circle back to that stone building, the place where their mother's voice had been buried. So one morning, before the sun had fully risen, they stood together outside its looming doors. The eldest clenched his fists, the second held the notebook to her chest, and the youngest whispered a prayer beneath her breath. They did not enter. Not yet. Instead, the second walked up the steps, knelt, and placed a single page on the threshold. It read, "The truth lives here, though they tried to kill it." When the doors opened that morning, the page was gone. But by nightfall, its words were already moving through the town. Confrontation spread like fire. A clerk muttered insults within earshot of the eldest and found himself pinned by the boy's stare until he stammered and fled. A shopkeeper refused the youngest service, but she stood in the doorway until other customers left in discomfort, forcing him to hand her the bread in silence. The second, bolder now, slipped longer passages into the cracks of the system, leaving them where lawyers might find them, embedding memory where the law had denied it. Every act carried risk, and every act carved deeper cracks into the walls built against them. But escalation has a price. One night, heavy footsteps pounded at their door. The eldest barely had time to bar it before fists struck the wood. Voices shouted from outside, "Enough lies! Shut your mouths, or we'll shut them for you." The second clutched the notebook to her chest. The youngest trembled, but her voice was steady. "Don't open it." The pounding went on for minutes that felt like hours, until finally the voices retreated, swallowed by the night. The triplets huddled together, shaking, listening to the silence. The eldest whispered, "They won't stop." The second answered, "Neither will we." And so the battle lines deepened, not in speeches or armies, but in the fragile, fierce acts of three children who refused to let their mother vanish. Eldest's fists became steady, not for striking, but for standing guard. The second's pen became sharper than any blade. The youngest's voice, small but unyielding, rang out against the silence. The town had wanted them quiet, but their defiance had become louder than silence, sharper than whispers. The courthouse loomed, still vast, still immovable. But for the first time, it looked less like a fortress and more like a challenge. The triplets did not yet know what would come, only that they could no longer go back. They had stirred the hornet's nest, and the sting was coming. The courthouse had always been a monument of silence. Its walls were thick with polished stone, its doors heavy with the weight of law. Every sound inside was swallowed and reshaped, turning into something colder, harsher. It was here their mother's voice had been silenced, her cries twisted into lies, her truth buried beneath the judge's gavel. Now, it was where the triplets returned, no longer children hiding at its shadow, but storm-bearers carrying her memory like fire. The morning they chose was deliberate. A hearing was scheduled for a case unrelated to their mother, but the whole town buzzed about it. The courtroom would be full. Eyes would watch. Whispers would spread. The eldest had said, "If we're going to speak, it has to be when they can't look away." The second carried her notebook, the leather cracked, pages spilling from its seams. Every word she had written, every fragment of truth, every shard of grief was pressed between those covers. The youngest wore her mother's scarf, tied tight around her neck, her hands clutching its edges like a tether to strength. They walked the streets together, side by side, and the town noticed. People turned, some muttering, some spitting, but some only stared in uneasy silence as the triplets climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom was already crowded. The benches were lined with townsfolk, eager for spectacle. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks scurried. The judge presiding that day wasn't the same who had condemned their mother, but his face bore the same indifference carved by years of power. The triplets slid onto a bench in the back. Whispers rippled. The air thickened. The eldest kept his head high, his gaze unblinking. The second gripped her notebook, her knuckles pale. The youngest's eyes darted around the room, wide but steady. The proceedings began, the drone of law filling the chamber. But the triplets weren't listening. They weren't here for the case. They were here for something else. It started with the second standing. Her voice trembled at first, but grew firmer. "We have words that need to be heard." All eyes turned, murmurs erupted. The judge's gavel struck, order in the court. But she didn't sit. She opened her notebook, pages fluttering, and began to read aloud. She stood here once, our mother, and told the truth. You turned her truth into lies. You let her bleed under your silence, and you buried her in shame. But we remember, and we will not let you forget. Gasps filled the room. A bailiff moved toward her, but the eldest stepped in front, his body a shield. She has the right to speak, he thundered, his voice echoing off stone. You silenced her once. You won't silence us. The gavel pounded again. Sit down. This is contempt. But the youngest's voice rose over him, small but piercing. You called her a liar, but she was our mother. She was our truth. And if you call us liars too, then call it, because we will not stop. The courtroom erupted. Some shouted for order, others hissed at the children, but a current of unease rippled among the crowd. Faces shifted, expressions faltering. The memory of the trial returned, ugly and raw, no longer buried. The second's words cut through the chaos. She read another passage. They said the law was blind, but we saw its eyes look away. We saw its hands take bribes. We saw its mouth twist words, and we saw it kill her. The judge's face flushed with fury. Remove them. Now. Bailiff moved in, but the eldest braced himself, arms wide, defiance burning in his eyes. He wasn't fighting with fists. He was fighting with presence, with refusal to bow. The crowd shouted louder. Some jeered, but others hesitated, their eyes darting from the children to the judge, from the gavel to the notebook. Truth had cracked the chamber open, and it was spilling everywhere. A lawyer shouted, "Let them speak." Another barked, "They're disgracing the court." But the tide was shifting. For every voice of scorn, another voice faltered into silence, uneasy. Some even leaned forward, listening. The youngest climbed onto the bench, scarf fluttering around her neck, and raised her small voice above the din. You told us she was nothing, but she was everything. She was our mother. She was a woman who dared to speak. You killed her once. But today, in this place, she lives again. The chamber went still, her words hanging heavy, undeniable. The judge slammed the gavel again, but his hand shook. This is unlawful. This is contempt. The second's reply was sharp as a blade. What is more contemptuous, our words, or your silence when you condemned an innocent woman? Gasps rippled. Even the bailiffs hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure. The eldest's voice thundered. This courthouse was built to protect truth. Instead, it buried it. Today, we dig it back out, and you cannot stop it. Chaos surged. Some in the crowd rose to their feet, arguing, shouting. Others sat, frozen, haunted. The courthouse no longer felt like a sanctuary of law, it felt like a battlefield. The bailiffs reached the siblings, but the youngest clutched her sister's notebook and shouted, "If you take it, you take our mother's voice again. And this time, the whole town will see you do it." The room froze. The bailiffs faltered, their hands half raised. The crowd shifted. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into murmured agreement. She's right. We saw it once. We can't watch it again. For the first time, doubt crawled across the judge's face. The second, trembling but unyielding, lifted a final page. She wrote this for us, before they took her. If they bury me, do not bury the truth with me. Carry it until the ground splits open, until someone hears. We are her children. And today, you hear. Silence fell, not the silence of repression, but the silence after thunder, heavy, expectant, electric. The eldest stood tall, shoulders squared. The youngest clutched the scarf tighter. The second closed the notebook. They had done it. They had dragged the truth back into the place that had killed it. But truth is not victory. The gavel struck one last time. The judge's voice, tight with fury, declared, "This court does not recognize your disruption. You are hereby expelled from these proceedings. Guards, escort them out." And yet, as the siblings were led toward the doors, heads did not turn away as they once had. Eyes followed them, faces some hostile, some uncertain, but many thoughtful lingered on the children, as if seeing them for the first time. The courthouse had not fallen. The law had not changed, but the silence was shattered, and silence, once broken, can never be mended. The triplets walked out together, hand in hand, into the sunlight. The scarf fluttered. The notebook pressed against their hearts. The eldest's jaw was set. The second's eyes burned. The youngest's voice whispered a promise. Their mother's. Truth now lived, not in whispers, not in shadows, but in the open air. And though the system still stood, for the first time, it trembled. The courthouse doors slammed behind them. For a long moment, the siblings just stood there on the steps, the echo of the gavel still rattling in their bones. Sunlight fell across the stone, too bright, too sharp. Their hearts hammered as if they had run miles, but they had only spoken, shouted, read their mother's truth into the marrow of the place that had killed her. The eldest let out a ragged breath. We did it. The second clutched the notebook to her chest, her hands trembling. We said it where they couldn't shut their ears. The youngest's fingers twisted the scarf tighter. But did they hear? The watching town, the crowd spilled out of the courthouse in waves, buzzing, muttering. Some faces were twisted in contempt, others in confusion, but a few, just a few, were carved with something heavier: recognition, shame. On the far side of the street, a grocer who once had refused to serve their mother stood still, his eyes darting as if replaying the words he had just heard. An old woman crossed herself, whispering, "God rest her soul," in a voice the triplets weren't meant to hear. But not all eyes softened. A man spat on the ground as he passed them. "Liars breed liars," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. Another added, stirring trouble like their mother, "Best they leave this town." The triplets said nothing. They stood their ground, and silence, uneasy and brittle, spread around them like a crack in glass. Back home, that night, their small house felt heavier than ever. Shadows crowded the corners. The air buzzed with what they had done. The eldest paced, fists clenching and unclenching. "They'll come after us. They'll call us liars again. They'll try to bury it, just like before." The second opened her notebook, her eyes lingering on the pages she hadn't read, yet fragments too raw, too broken. "But they can't unhear it. Even if they deny it." They heard her words. The youngest curled against the scarf. "I saw it. I saw some of them listening. Even if they hated it, they were listening." The three sat together in silence, the weight of their mother's absence pressing down, but also her presence, in the words that had been spoken aloud, echoing now beyond their walls. The town's division, the days that followed, fractured the town. At the market, whispers circled like smoke. "Did you hear the children?" Stood right up in court, defying the judge. Shameless, just like their mother. But others whispered differently. She was telling the truth all along. The law silenced her, and now it's silencing them. Maybe we were wrong. The courthouse confrontation became a ghost that haunted every gathering. At church, sermons stumbled as parishioners shifted uncomfortably. In taverns, men argued until fists flew. On street corners, old friends found themselves divided. The memory of the woman they had buried now clawing its way back into light. The children felt it everywhere. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations hushed when they walked past. Some doors opened with hesitant kindness on. Apples slipped into their hands. A loaf of bread left at their step. Others slammed shut with curses, and stones hurled against their walls at night. The eldest bore the stones in silence, jaw tight. The second wrote everything down: the insults, the gifts, the trembling contradictions of a town unsure of itself. The youngest listened hardest to the silences, the places where once there had been nothing but scorn, and now there was hesitation. The judge's fury news reached them quickly. The judge had filed charges for contempt of court. The siblings were to be summoned, punished, made an example of. "They want to put us on trial," the eldest muttered, fury tightening his shoulders. "Then let them," the second whispered, defiant. "Every word they say against us will only echo what they did to her. They'll prove our point without knowing it." The youngest's voice trembled. "But what if they take us away, like they took her?" The thought hung in the air like a blade. None of them said what they feared most: that the town might stand aside again, might let it happen again. But outside their door, rumors spread faster than the judge's edicts. People whispered not of contempt, but of courage. Some called for punishment, but others said quietly, "If they punish the children for speaking, it proves everything they said." The system they had struck was rattling, uncertain of how hard to press down. Small shifts days bled into nights. The children walked cautiously, but they no longer bowed their heads, and they began to notice things. The tailor's wife, once sharp-tongued and cruel, stopped them on the street and murmured, "Your mother bought cloth here once. I never looked her in the eye. I'm sorry." Her apology was whispered, barely audible, but it was more than they had ever heard before. The schoolmaster, who had once mocked them as liars' spawn, sent a message that they could return to class if they wished. They did not. But the offer itself struck deep in acknowledgement, however small. Yet, with each shift, toward them came resistance just as fierce. One evening, their window shattered under a rock. A note tied to it read, "Leave this town before you poison it further." The eldest burned the note, his hands shaking but his voice firm. "We're not leaving, not now, not ever." Among themselves in the nights, when the world was quiet, the siblings sat together, their voices low, fragile, but unbreakable. The second read aloud from the notebook, not to the town this time, but to her siblings, words their mother had written in quiet despair, but also in stubborn hope. "They think silence protects them. But silence is a crack in glass. One day, it shatters." The youngest whispered. She knew someone would carry it. The eldest put an arm around them both, and we did, for the first time since her death. They let themselves cry, not the choked sobs of the funeral, not the hollow grief of survival, but tears that burned and cleansed, carrying both pain and pride. The tremor in the town by the end of the week. The town was not the same. The courthouse still stood, the judge still ruled, the law still spoke in its cold, clipped voice, but something underneath had cracked. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Old accusations were whispered again, but this time they weren't all against the mother. Some asked aloud, why did the law come down on her so hard? Why were we so quick to believe? Shops that had once banned the children began quietly serving them again, though never with smiles. The church pews shifted, families sitting apart, who once had prayed together. It wasn't healing. It wasn't justice, but it was changed on. In the midst of it, the triplets carried their mother's voice like a torch, flickering but unextinguished. A quiet realization one evening, as the sun fell red across the rooftops, the youngest spoke softly. "Maybe we didn't go there to win. Maybe we went there to break something. And we did." The eldest nodded slowly. The silence is broken." The second closed the notebook with reverence, "and once broken, it can't be made whole again." They sat together on their doorstep, watching the town lights flicker on, listening to the uneasy hum of a community no longer certain of itself. For the first time, the triplets felt not just grief, not just rage, but something else, something almost like the beginning of power. The triplets woke to quiet, no stones against the window, no jeers outside their door, only the soft hum of morning, the sound of a town holding its breath. It had been 2 weeks since they had stood in the courthouse and spoken their mother's words into the marrow of the place that killed her. 2 weeks of whispers, threats, apologies, and uneasy shifts. 2 weeks in which they had walked streets that felt both hostile and strangely changed. The eldest sat at the small table, repairing a loose hinge on the door. His shoulders were still, tense, but the restless fury had eased into a steady watchfulness. The second filled page after page in her notebook, recording not only her mother's words, but their own, what they had seen, what they had endured, what they refused to forget. The youngest sat on the steps, scarf looped around her neck, watching the street as if it might speak. The judge's retreat word reached them soon. The judge had dropped the charges. He gave no reason, but everyone knew. To drag the children into court again would make him the villain their words had painted him to be. To punish them would only fan the fire. He could not silence them now without confirming the truth of everything they had said. The judge still sat on the bench, but the gavel no longer rang with the same certainty. Every ruling was now weighed against the memory of the children's defiance. Some obeyed out of habit, others muttered of hypocrisy. The law, once untouchable, now carried cracks like spider webs. A town changed, but not healed. Life stumbled forward, uneven and fractured. The baker sold them bread, without a word. The blacksmith tipped his cap when they passed, though his eyes slid away in shame. The grocer still muttered curses under his breath, but his hands trembled when he gave them change. Church pews were emptier on Sundays. Some stayed away, unwilling to pray beside those they now suspected of cruelty. Families, once bound by silence, were now divided by questions they could not unask. The triplets felt it in every step. They had broken something, and the pieces did not fit back together. Their own path one evening. The eldest spoke as they ate a meager supper. "We can't stay children forever." The second looked up from her notebook. "We already aren't." The youngest chewed slowly, then whispered, "Then what do we do?" It was the question that had lingered since the courthouse. Their act had not ended with applause or justice. It had ended with a town unsettled, a judge diminished, and their mother's truth hanging in the air like smoke. But it was not enough to have broken the silence. They needed to decide how to live inside the noise they had created. Small acts of defiance in the weeks that followed. The siblings did not retreat. The eldest began to help the blacksmith, not for pay, but to prove he belonged where once he was shunned. His quiet strength, his refusal to flinch, forced even the hardest eyes to meet him eventually. The second began copying her mother's writings, one page at a time, and slipping them beneath doors, leaving them on benches, tucking them into hymnal. At church, each page carried her mother's voice into corners the courthouse walls had never reached. The youngest gathered children in the square, telling stories not of bitterness, but of their mother's laughter, her songs, her fierce gentleness. She wove memory into play, so that those too young to remember might carry her spirit forward without shame. These acts were small, but together they grew. They were not a movement, not yet, but they were seeds. The town's reckoning months passed, and with them, slow, reluctant reckoning. A merchant, once loud in condemning their mother, fell ill. On his deathbed, he called for the triplets. His voice cracked as he whispered, I lied because it was easier. I am sorry. They said nothing, only listened. But when he died, word of his confession spread. Others followed, not all apologies, not all admissions, but enough that the silence of certainty was gone. The town no longer spoke with one voice. It argued, it splintered, it remembered. And in that remembering, the woman they had buried wrong began to live again, not in flesh, but in story. The triplets together on the anniversary of her death. The triplets walked to her grave. The ground was still, the grass long. No one else came. They knelt together. The eldest placed his calloused hand on the earth. We carried it, Mother. We carried it where they couldn't ignore it. The second set her notebook down, now thick with new pages. Your words are no longer just ours. They're theirs too. They're everyone's. The youngest pressed her scarf into the soil. And you're not alone anymore. For a long time they sat in silence, but it was not the heavy silence of before. It was full, alive, threaded with the echo of all that had been said and all that would never be unsaid. The legacy years later, when strangers passed through the town, they sometimes heard the story, how 3 children once stood in a courthouse and defied the law with their mother's words, how their voices cracked the silence that had bound the place for too long. Some told it with bitterness, as a tale of disobedience. Others told it with pride, as proof that even the smallest could stand against power. But, however it was told, it was never forgotten. The town could no longer bury the woman, nor her children. In silence, the final realization one evening, the triplets sat again on their doorstep, older now, faces lined not by years alone but by what they had carried. The eldest said quietly, we thought we were fighting to prove her innocence. The second nodded, but we were fighting for more, for the right to speak, even when the world doesn't want to hear. The youngest looked at them both, her scarf faded but still wrapped around her. And we did, we spoke. And now, it will never be silent again. They sat together, the weight of loss, still heavy, but the legacy clear. Their mother lived in them, in the town, in the cracks they had opened. Her truth had become their truth, and truth, once spoken, had no cage. Closing image at the courthouse still stood, stern and weathered, its walls holding centuries of judgment. But if you listened closely in the stillness, you could almost hear it, the faint echo of children's voices, ringing out against gavel and law, refusing to be silenced. It was not justice, it was not healing, but it was memory on. Memory was enough to keep the silence from ever closing in again.